Hello and welcome. You're listening to the American Interest Podcast with me, Richard Aldous. My guest this week is Sulmaan Wasif Khan, Professor of International History at Tufts and author of Haunted by Chaos, China's Grand Strategy from Mao to Xi. His essay, How to Think About China, appears in the current print issue of the American Interest in subscribers' mailboxes this month. Sulmaan, welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Richard. Thanks for having me again.
So China has very much been in the news in relation to the coronavirus crisis. So how should we be thinking about China?
I think the first thing we need to realize as we think about China is that the mistake we've made most often, past and present, certainly in the United States, is projecting onto it. China becomes a vessel for everything that happens to be worrying us at a given moment. You can see that in this country right now with the rush to blame China, and China exclusively, for the failure to deal with the coronavirus. There is a lot of blame to go around, and China certainly holds a large share of it. But using that to avoid hard questions about social safety nets, about a lack of preparedness, about a lack of preparedness not just in the administration, but in various government agencies. That's something that Americans have done in the past, and it's something that's troubling us right now, too.
Although, isn't one of the interesting aspects of this current crisis that actually rhetorical solutions, rhetorical problems really don't matter? It's real problems, real solutions that matter. And certainly what a lot of commentators and certainly politicians have made the argument that China has behaved in a way that has hidden away facts about the coronavirus crisis and that has allowed it to become a global phenomenon.
I think that's absolutely true. I also think we need to get the whole story right in all its nuance, all its detail, because there will be another pandemic. There might be a deadlier pandemic. And if someone were writing, as you or I might, or colleagues of ours might, 20, 30 years from now, a global history of the coronavirus pandemic, then China would be the starting point, obviously. But then there'd be multiple choices that countries made in response to that. The original sin here, to my mind, is not just hiding the facts, but you go further back. The obvious one is the disruption of ecosystems that not just China, but all of us have engaged in. And if you think about SARS, for example, that was a very clear case of eating wild animals can be dangerous. Disrupting ecosystems can be very dangerous. And certain countries have learned from that. And this was a lesson, by the way, that people within China had taken on right after that crisis. There's this, speaking of rhetoric, myth going around that the Chinese eat everything, which misses out on the fact that many Chinese don't frequent markets like the one in Wuhan, or the one where SARS originated. They are victims as much as anybody else. And the current Chinese government push to do something about that is probably the first step to making sure this doesn't happen again. So that was off-ramp number one, if you would, that was missed in this crisis. But the second one, as you say, is covering up. And there you're dealing with a culture of governance that is based on telling your superiors what they want to hear. My first experience of this many, many, many years ago now, when I was traveling in Tibet, was meeting someone who was in charge of calculating GDP growth for the year. And I asked him how that worked, and he said, they just tell us what they want to hear, and we fill that number in. Which was absolutely bizarre to me, but as I traveled around more, began to make sense. And in reporting the deaths from the virus, the nature of the virus, its transmissibility, you could see that at work. Now, against that, there is also and this goes back into Chinese history, the tradition of the courageous expert or the courageous sage saying something is up, telling that to the government and getting crushed for it.
And that very much seems to have happened here with the doctor, sometimes referred to as the whistleblower doctor, who first tried to alert the Chinese authorities to what was going on in Wuhan.
Exactly. That happened to multiple doctors, to Aifan and to Liu Yang. It's also happened to nurses, presumably, and to others we don't hear about, because there's an interest in keeping this quiet, because there was a goal of shut the virus down. And if you tell people the virus isn't cooperating with us, you are giving news your superiors don't want to hear.
There seems to as well been a kind of an active, kind of in some ways telling your superiors what they want to hear, and this kind of thing is a kind of a passive act. But there also seems to have been an attempt by the Chinese government to intervene on a global scale, particularly with all, things like the World Health Organization, to cover up what was going on. What do you make of that situation?
I think the situation was eminently predictable, and, people actually did predict it. So the bit we're laying out about there would be a virus like this, there was going to be the transmissibility being covered up issue. That was something that various people had already flagged. The intelligence community in the United States, which is one of the few government agencies that's come out looking good from this, actually had this figured out. The notion that the Chinese would intervene in an international organization to perpetuate a cover-up, not surprising. The notion that there would be people who would see this coming, to someone who's dealt with China for a while and who's talked to people who deal with China at a much more sophisticated level than I do, also not surprising. What is surprising is the bit where, having known all that, a country like the United States would find itself completely unprepared and shocked. So there's blame to go on China. There's blame to go to the WHO, which, as has now been established, was alerted to the possibility of human-to-human transmission by Taiwan. But to have all those pieces together, to know that there was going to be, in all likelihood, a cover-up, and to then not be prepared for it, there's blame over there too. And that's the bit that I think the rhetorical finaglings, as it were, don't get to. If Taiwan can be prepared for it, having gone through the experience of SARS, knowing what it's like to deal with China, can make a case for South Korea too. It's somewhat surprising that the rest of us weren't prepared to do the same.
Now, of course, one of the things about this crisis is that it seems to have ramped up a rivalry between China and the United States that had been going on, certainly at the very least, since 2016 and the election of President Trump. Where do you think that this current crisis fits in that broader picture?
It seems to be of a piece with it. It does seem to have, interestingly enough, change the power dynamic within each country, or at least have the potential to change the power dynamic within each country. It's too soon to tell how this is going to play out, but you can see, and this is one of the things we get wrong when we think about China, that it is possible that the death of a doctor or the death of a parent and the regime's incapacity to deal with this could lead to massive upheaval, if not now, then 5, 10, 15 years down the line, where the full scale of the tragedy becomes apparent. In this country, you're seeing, people are grateful right now for the federal system working, for Massachusetts, California, and New York taking steps, regardless of what the president has to say. But that acceleration of independent policymaking could well change the balance of power within this country too. On a more global scale, I think China's going to have a hard time finding friends after this. It's a bad time to make the case that the Chinese handle this well. Even in Pakistan, which, once upon a time you'd have been hard put to find people saying bad things about China. You had begun to see, even in the ramp up to this, an uptick in criticism of the Chinese, partly because of the growing intimacy of the relationship. But after this, one of the videos that was going around the country was Shoaib Akhtar, an ex-cricketer and interesting persona, who was lecturing the Chinese on why couldn't they eat halal food. Now, as I say, most Chinese don't frequent wild markets, but most of them don't think about halal either, unless you happen to be a Muslim minority. And the fact that that rhetoric was coming out of Pakistan and being circulated shows you something about how much blame there is to go around on this. The other thing the virus does is, of course, is it renders the rivalry at a certain level irrelevant. This is now about human survival in the face of a threat to the species. The countries that have handled it best haven't been the great powers duking it out for mastery of the world. They've been the humble, technocratic, sensible countries. New Zealand, Taiwan, Germany. So that's the interesting thing to me in terms of what this means for great power rivalry.
It's interesting in that context as well. I mean, I noticed in The Economist last week that their lead article asked the question, "Is China winning?" And part of the argument that was made there was that a lot of foreign policy watchers seem to have concluded that China, whatever China has done, the really significant factor in all of this crisis is that people looking at the United States are going to say, hang on a second, the great power, the number one power, is not able to deal with this massive crisis and certainly is not prepared to lead the world on this massive crisis. What do you make of that argument?
I think foreign policy watchers are sometimes too quick to jump to conclusions, and I'm guilty of that myself, of course. I honestly think if you're sitting as a responsible statesperson in a country that's afflicted by the virus right now, the great power rivalry is probably not what's top of your mind. Top of your mind is probably, how can we get enough testing out and about? How can we institute contact tracing? And what do we have to do to weather this upheaval? The countries I mentioned, New Zealand, Taiwan, probably haven't paid much attention to what will China and the US do. You do have to factor that in terms of what is it going to mean for the economy going forward? What is it going to mean for flights going forward? A whole bunch of things. But in the crisis itself, you have to rely on yourself. That seems to be the big lesson from it. You have to have the capacities, medical, leadership to weather this. And neither China nor the United States are going to be very helpful.
I'm curious about the thing that you said there about people not really being interested in great power rivalries and so on. I know that you've been aware of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee chairman in the UK, Tom Tugendhat, accusing tyrannical China of falsifying coronavirus death statistics. It's been a big diplomatic row with the Chinese ambassador hitting back on that. I mean, Tom Tugendhat is known as a fairly phlegmatic character. He's not somebody who would necessarily be thought of as ramping up rhetoric and so on. So it does seem to indicate that these issues are still very much in the air, that it's not just the practical medical things, that there is a kind of I hate to use the cliche, but there is some kind of existential struggle going on here too.
I mean, I would come back to that, though, and say that that particular rhetoric doesn't seem to tie into great power competition. That seems to tie into the specific provenance of the virus and where the blame for a country having to deal with this lies, which is a good question to ask down the line when we're talking about how to prevent the next one. So saying tyrannical China falsified the statistics is, given what we've been discussing, probably a perfectly true statement. And certainly goes against the notion that China is winning this. It also is a statement that, if you're trying to figure out how to deal with China right now, may or may not be helpful. It's certainly helpful if down the line, the UK is charting a course for how do we deal with this thing. And at that point you say, okay, we institute recognition that till such time as there's a massive overhaul, not just in the current regime in China, but in the whole culture of governance there, expecting it to be forthcoming about a virus like this, and there will be more viruses, is foolhardy. We need to build some slack into the system to deal with that.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the books that you review in the essay for the American Interest, Julia Lovell's book on Maoism. You kind of draw out the way that she talks about the role of ideology in China's leaders. That's something very much that you emphasize in your own book. I just kind of wonder, to what extent do you think ideology has played a role in China's response to the current crisis?
I'm not sure it's an ideology at this point. I'd have to think about it more systematically and see how it fit that. But there certainly is a belief in the system on the part of the government, and that's being articulated. Now, the interesting thing, of course, about Lovell's book is the ideology she's describing often emerges in response to devastating conditions, Maoism. Mao himself emerges at a time when China is torn apart. Nepal, which is her best chapter by far, and I'm glad you brought the book up, she talks about the poverty and the misery and how that leads to the ideology being appealing. The ideology being perpetuated now is a different one in that it's an ideology based on a support of authoritarianism, a strongman response, shut the city down. Now, that rhetoric has some effect, but in the context of the virus, two things are worth saying. One is that it's not rhetoric that's borne out by the facts if you look at the people who have dealt with this best. Dealing with this best has been independent of ideology and in a way a testament to a certain strand of liberalism, a strand that holds everybody should get decent healthcare because if they don't, we all fall apart. A strand that holds government can be a force for good when it comes to contact tracing. A strand that holds, this is New Zealand, not only can we flatten the curve, we can eliminate the virus if we all work together. There's a real liberal set of beliefs at the core of those policies, and those set of beliefs are able to be implemented because of the technocratic competence I'm talking about. But the other thing to say, since we brought up Lovell's book and ideology, is what does the world look like after the virus? People are already talking about, Adam Tooze notably, the economic ripples of this, what this means for people to come. And that's where the danger of an ideology like Maoism appearing is really terrifying.
It is one of the things that surprised me in the review essay for the American Interest that you kind of say that really the United States currently has no China policy. Well, what did you mean by that?
I think I meant that while the debate about what to do about China has been extremely heated, and while, in fairness, that's a debate that heats up every time there's a presidential election, but in this context, at this moment, is especially fervent. The nature of that policy hasn't been clarified. So there's a we need to be tough on China line that's taken hold. That's perfectly fair. Nobody is specifying what does being tough on China look like. Does it mean we're willing to clap sanctions on the Chinese leadership for violations of either human rights or what we define as core interests? Does it mean we're prepared to go to war with China for the South China Sea? Does it mean that we're going to move to set up a parallel set of international institutions? In the context of the WHO, freezing funding means we're kind of giving up on it at a time when the Chinese are ramping their own funding up. Now, you can say to that, that might be a good idea if there were another plan in place, another organization that could take the WHO's place, maybe with Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, technocrats from around the world cooperating. But that's not the policy.
Is it that it's not there? I'm just kind of thinking about the difference between these kind of tactical, operational decisions and strategy. That it seems clear to me as a non-China specialist, of course, that kind of in 2016 there was a clear change in the direction of strategy, that there was a decision that we can recognise to push back, whatever that means, against the rise of China. and that you may say, well, maybe sanctions or maybe trade, kind of trade tariffs and so on, they may or may not be the right way to do it. But there's a clear strategic direction, isn't there, that is visibly different to that, say, of the Obama administration.
I think there was an attempt at a clear strategic direction, and the trade war was a piece of that. But even there, looking at the back and forth really was what impressed me most. So one day, Trump is celebrating his friendship with Xi Jinping. The next day, it's tariffs and a trade war. Then the next day, it's we might redo those. Then the next day, those are on again. There wasn't any sense of consistency, really. And the objective of all this, at not just a trade level, but at a broader, what do we want from China and what we can get from China, wasn't really clear. To pursue a trade war is, and certainly with that level of erratic flip-flopping, it looks like a policy, but if you think about a policy in terms of we have a set of interests to pursue. Here's where this country fits into those interests. Here's what we can and cannot get from that country. Therefore, this is how we approach this country overall. That, to my mind, was what was missing.
I mean, presumably, knock on wood as I say this, 2020 is an election year, so we hope there will be an election in November. Do you think that this will be pivotal on China policy? That if Joe Biden is looking to go back to that Obama policy, obviously President Trump would be doing what has been going on since 2016. That would actually seem to me to make 2020 quite a pivotal election when it comes to China policy. What do you think?
Well, the interesting thing here actually is, and if you go back to 2016, and think about trade and TPP, what was interesting was that the candidates, Democratic and Republican, were actually quite aligned on that. They were responding to forces within this country. Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Trump had basically the same stance on trade with Asia and what a free trade agreement should look like. Pursued in a different tone, in a different way, but in substance the same. And if you happen to be in Japan at the time, as I was, somewhat annoying to people. The other thing to say, of course, is, one of the sources of foreign policy we tend to forget about in this country is Congress. And what I think the Trump administration might have been unprepared for, and we won't know this till decades down the line when archives open up, is for the Marco Rubios of the world, for example, to listen to what might have been an offhand tweet about getting tough on China and running with it so far and so fast that backing away from that policy became difficult. If the British stumbled into their empire in a fit of absence of mind, we might well have stumbled into a China trade war, if not a China policy, in a fit of excitement. So for 2020, again, what's interesting is you've got Democrats accusing Trump of being too nice to China right now, which is kind of surprising. And I think at least until the election, and I'm hoping it's November too, at least until the election, I would expect both sides to vie on who's tougher on China, which is a very standard trope in American politics. I would, after that, going forward, assuming a Democratic administration comes in, like to see, I don't know that I will see, but what I would like to see would be a review of China policy. So what have we done thus far? Has it worked? Has it not worked? How much can we actually change China? My answer is probably not much. You can do some stuff at the margins, but really the kind of things we're talking about, getting it not to falsify information, that's something that has to come from within a country. But then with a clear-eyed appraisal of, okay, we can't count on China to come clean about the next virus, but can we institute certain checks on flights before they come back and forth? Can we stock up on cotton swabs? What are our priorities in Asia? And how much do the Chinese challenge them? And which of those are crucial to our definition of national security? That's a conversation that needs to happen in this country sooner rather than later. And the virus might be an impetus for it.
So the essay is How to Think About China. It's written by my guest, Sulmaan Wasif Khan, and appears in the current print issue of The American Interest. But for now, Sulmaan, thanks again for joining us on the American Interest podcast.
Thanks very much, Richard. Pleasure being here.
So that's it from us this week. Don't forget to check our website, theamericaninterest.com, and to subscribe to the show on your podcast app. The show is produced by Damir Marusik with Sean Keeney. Do join us again next time. But for now, this is me, Richard Aldous, saying stay well and thanks for listening.